Okay, well, welcome everybody. I hope you're doing well. I'm delighted that you could join us this evening or this afternoon or whatever time it is somewhere in the world where you're joining us from. Um, so virtual welcome from the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society. We're excited to be hosting this event. I'm just going to tell you a tiny bit about the Institute, which we refer to as IBIS, before we launch into the event itself. So IBIS builds on a long tradition of environmental study at Brown. The Center for Environmental Studies was one of the first centers at a university. It was established in the 1970s. And then out of that grew IBIS, which was established in 2014, really with this goal of integrating research and education and doing it in a multidisciplinary way. Among environmental institutes in the United States, we're relatively unique. First of all, in being quite large, especially for a private school. But we also have a really even split in our expertise among natural and social scientists. And that opens up a whole set of questions that we're interested in pursuing, and we have the right sort of background to go after. We also have an exciting undergraduate program. We're actually one of the few environmental institutes that runs our own undergraduate major. And we train amazing students who go out and solve the problems that we need solved. So, you know, we as an institute have a lot of expertise in climate change. You know, sort of three primary strengths. One is understanding how the climate misinformation campaign works. And there is a concerted misinformation campaign out there, as you're probably aware, but we're sort of decoding it and deconstructing it and figuring out how to make positive policy changes going forward. We also have a lot of expertise around climate change and conservation of biological diversity, saving ecosystems, saving species, and figuring out how to do that in a strategic way. And we have a lot of expertise in studying the part of the world that's changing most rapidly under climate change, which is the Arctic. You know, the ice sheets are disappearing, and that's having spillover benefits for all of us with sea level rise and in other ways. Anyway, we're holding this panel tonight on fire for a few reasons. One, because we think it's important, but also because it sits squarely at this interface of science, policy, and society. This is actually going to be, this is the first panel event in a new series that we'll be hosting, a series with panels featuring experts. And the panel is going to be oriented around environment and society and issues at that interface. So today we have a really impressive array of speakers with a broad, as you'll see, set of expertise, all very accomplished. Two of the speakers helped to organize this event. They are Brown alum, and they actually serve on the advisory council at IBIS. And, you know, I hope that you find this event entertaining and informative, and that it leaves you excited to do more. So I'm going to turn it over now to Ricardo Baione, who will be moderating the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Dove. As he said, my name is Ricardo Baione. I'm a partner and founder at a group called Encourage Capital. Encourage is an impact investment firm, and we look for investments that are both good for society, good for the environment, but also good investments and provide a return on investment to people putting money in. And we think that's important because having a return on investment will mean more of it gets done. There'll be more money for conservation, more money for these sorts of things that I think we all care about. We've been doing a bit of work on fire, largely through work that Zach is undertaking, and you'll hear more about that down the line. But I will start off by saying I am no expert on fires. I am a total amateur, and like many people have watched what's happened on TV, as well as have suffered through it since I live in San Francisco. I saw the post-apocalyptic orange glowy skies during this crazy fire year. So impacted, I care about this. I've been talking with people like Zach and others who have known a lot about how fires work and what can be done about them for some time. So I know what the problems are, or at least I have some idea from it. But what struck me over time was that if you're just watching this on TV, if you're just seeing it unfold, if you're just hearing comments from one side or the other, I think it's hard to really understand sort of the nuance and the depth of the problem that we're suffering in the Western US. And just to say that it's not just the Western US, that we're seeing fires all over the world, from the Amazon to Russia to Australia to a lot of different places. And I'm not going to say all of the dynamics of all of those fires are the same. They're not. But it is a bit of a global problem. And so we thought that this being an incredibly topical issue, one that a lot of people care about, one that probably impacts many, many people in the Western United States, in cities like San Francisco, Seattle, Portland, going all the way up to Canada, Vancouver, and places like that. And this year affected all of the Intermountain West. Smoke got all the way to the East Coast. So it affected the entire country. We thought it'd be good to talk to people who do actually know a lot about this subject, to get a sense of what is going on, what is happening, what truly underlies this problem. What are the causes? What are the implications, both in terms of economic implications, health implications, and maybe start to get some idea of what can be done to address this problem. So I'm standing in for your amateur talk show host who doesn't fully understand the issue, but wants to ask some questions about it. So we're going to be running this less like a series of presentations and more like a conversation, sort of a talk show format. And we have a great panel of speakers. I'm going to ask them now to turn on their videos and introduce themselves. And then I'll start off by asking some questions, and we'll hopefully get into a series of comments and discussions. And for those of you who are in the audience, we're going to reserve some time at the end to answer your questions. And so I encourage you to go to the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen and start typing in any questions you might have. And I can't promise we'll get to them all, but we'll try and get to as many as we possibly can. Just so everyone knows, this is being recorded, and we'll see if we can post this for people who aren't able to attend. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Paul Hesburgh to introduce themselves. Dr. Hesburgh.
Thanks, Ricardo. I'm Paul Hesburgh. I live in Washington State, and I've been doing wildfire and landscape ecology research for the last 36 years as a research landscape ecologist with Forest Service, Research and Development Branch, and also research faculty at University of Washington, Oregon State University. And I basically study climate, vegetation, and wildfire interactions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today.
Great. And for those of you who don't know Paul, he has a great TED Talk that goes into even more depth about some of the issues we're going to talk about today. So I encourage you to Google that. Thanks, Paul. Tess?
Hi, my name is Tess Carter. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at MIT, and my work focuses on fires and how the smoke that they produce impacts air quality and climate. So I'm excited to be here for that reason. Before MIT, though, I also worked on the National Climate Assessment, which is the state of the science around climate change and its impacts in DC. And then before that, I actually did my undergrad at Brown in chemistry. I also received a fellowship through IBIS to work on nitrogen and air quality. And I currently sit on the IBIS Advisory Council as well, as Dove mentioned.
And Tess, I should say, has been fundamental at helping us organize this event. So thank you for all your work on that, Tess. Dr. Sarah Henderson. Sarah?
Hi there, my name is Sarah Henderson. I'm the Senior Environmental Health Scientist at the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control. So whenever Ricardo says Western US, I fill that in with Western North America because we have lots of wildfire and smoke in Western Canada as well. I've been studying the impacts of wildfire smoke on populations in Canada and worldwide for almost 20 years now.
Thank you. Sorry about that. And I'll try to modify to Western North America and be a bit more inclusive. Apologies. Zach Knight. Zach?
Yes, I live in Western North America, in the state of California. So I'll start there. Hey, everybody, my name is Zach Knight. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of Blue Forest Conservation. And we're a nonprofit that works with the World Resources Institute and the U.S. Forest Service to create a public-private partnership called the Forest Resilience Bond. And the aim there is to help the Forest Service finance much needed ecological restoration treatments to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire while creating a number of other ecological co-benefits in that work. Look forward to sharing more about that today.
Great. So in the spirit of sort of moving into this talk show format and sort of asking ourselves, okay, what is happening here? Let's try and understand this a little bit better. You know, most of us who've been affected by it or who have been watching it in the media have seen the problems. We've heard a number of people talk about what's causing this. And we've heard everything from, you know, it's climate change, it's droughts, it's bad forest management. We should change our management regimes. We should protect homes and houses. We should, you know, do all kinds of things, even as far as like buying rakes and raking the forest. So I think there's a little bit of confusion as to what exactly is going on. So maybe we can turn to Dr. Hesburgh to give us a deeper, more nuanced understanding of this, and to understand, is this a trend? How is that going on? What's been happening? And to give us his perspective on, you know, is this the new normal? And if not, how do we make it not be the new normal? Speaking from those of us who have suffered those orange skies, certainly. Dr. Hesburgh?
Thanks, Ricardo. Well, new normal implies that a new mean condition is happening, and we don't suspect that that's occurring. We expect an escalating condition, making this quite a compelling topic to solve from several vantage points. I study how landscapes have changed and how that motivates processes like insect outbreaks and wildfire behavior. And I want to show you a couple of props here because I think they're quite compelling, and they create the sort of visual impact that I'm shooting for here. And these are just going to give you some examples of the kinds of conditions. We've reconstructed some 500 randomly sampled landscapes throughout Western North America. And these are the kinds of changes from the early 20th to the early 21st century that we've seen. This is an area close to my home here, and I'm looking at some dry pine and dry mixed conifer and some moist mixed conifer forest. And you can see in a little less than a century how a very patchy landscape with open ridges and open dry aspects has become rather cluttered with trees. And there's a lot of dense arrangements of those trees. This is a little further up the hill. That's Mount Rainier there in the background. And you can see that a varied forest age and density patchwork has become really uniform. There's a lot of fire on the historical landscape, and that produced heterogeneous patterns of forest age, density, species composition, and that's a critical change across many landscapes. There's a handful of change agents that are really important. As you well know, starting in the 1890s or so, we started logging in the interior, the really large fire-tolerant trees, and those spaces were filled in by shade-loving species as the big trees were removed through several passes. We excluded fire, and this goes back a really long way, starting with the introduction of European diseases in the 1700s and 1800s. And there'd been a ton of indigenous burning that had gone on for nearly 10,000 years. And so this die-off event, the loss of Indian burning, already had begun to change this landscape, add cattle and sheep in large droves, development for agriculture and the built environment, and then lay over the top of that fire suppression, which gets really successful from 1935 on to basically 1985. And so keeping fire out of the woods was a big deal. And now you add over the top of that climate change. The climate's getting warmer, it's getting drier, it's often windier, and these relationships are not constant. They're escalating right now. And we now know that the climate is critical for explaining burned area. during the warmest years and the warmest decadal droughts, we see much larger area burned, and that's not going to change. In fact, we expect area burned to triple and quadruple over the next 30 years by 2050. And so the thing that we actually have some influence over is not area burned, but how severely it burns. And here's a couple of key feedbacks I want to show you that are really critical. So in those dry forests, you had regular fires every 5 to 30 years, 35 years, and they were burning out the dead wood in the forest floor and the fuel ladders that would make crown fires possible. So crown fires were unlikely in these frequent fire forests. Another critical feedback is that fires created patchworks, and these patchworks of grass and shrubs, young, middle-aged, and old forests, open versus closed canopy conditions, they regulated the future size and severity of fires. So spatial controls that regulated fire size and severity were taken out of that landscape as a consequence of those factors that I just showed you. All right. And so this is basically what happened. We got an epidemic of trees on an awful lot of our landscapes. You take fire out of that system and you get this continuous regeneration and release of fire tolerant species or intolerant species. And fires can walk up from the dead fuels through these fuel ladders into the crowns of the larger and older trees.
Let me push you a little bit on this. So you've talked about forest management practices and the change over time. You mentioned climate change being layered in. How is that affecting things, and how big a factor is it in your view as compared to sort of forest management practices?
Both of them are involved. Through the last 30 years, we've come to understand that area burned for millennia has been driven by the climate. And we're finding out that the current warming trend is continuing to govern area burn, but we're seeing a rapid rise now in area burn. So the climate is huge and it's unmistakable, and that's a global observation. Within the areas that are fire prone, Mediterranean climate regions, climate has a huge influence on area burned, and we expect area burned to climb steadily to the mid-century, 21st century.
So I guess what I'm hearing is a much more pessimistic view that not only is this potentially not the new normal, this may be the best we see in the near future if area burn continues to get even worse and worse. Or is there an optimistic twist to this?
There's a huge optimistic twist to this. Remember, I said that Western North American tribes were critical to burning the landscape. What they did is they essentially burned often enough because they were living in this landscape and they were seasonally encamped. What they needed to do was to blunt the potential influence of the largest, severest fires. And so what they did is they burned regularly to influence whether or not a fire could get severe. If you think of an event size distribution where the largest events are out on the tail, they clipped the tail on the event size distribution by active fire management, by burning the landscape. And I believe that's Alan Taylor at Penn State's got some excellent work out in 2016 showing in the Sierra Nevadas that those tribes were highly influential to influencing over deep time how big and how hot fires got as a consequence of regular burning, basically treating the landscape. So I think there's a strong and deep line of evidence that we can influence the Achilles heel of the wildfire regime, and that's the fuel side.
Right. And now that probably has implications in terms of still releasing smoke and pollutants and additional greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But I guess your view is that that's better than the massive type of fires we saw this year.
No, I mean, I'd love to eradicate all smoke because it has a huge impact on populations. I now have pulmonary issues from researching wildfire and spending a month a year in the bush during the fire season. I've got asthma and I have to take a rescue inhaler with me. So I'm bullish on reducing smoke as it affects the human population. But the problem is in all of our simulations throughout Western forest types, there is no future without fire and smoke. And so the question becomes, what do the low smoke options look like? And when you start to balance that with carbon and substitution values for emissions, the question becomes, are there opportunities to buy down the severity and the PM 2.5 and other emissions. And there are options for being able to do that. Some of it is in substitution of values and in carbon accounting, and some of it is in reducing the amount of smoke that wildfires are currently treating to the lowest level possible. And that's through fuel treatments.
And we've had a couple of questions, one beforehand and one that just was asked. So previously, somebody named John O'Connell asked, I've heard that California has two different types of wildfires. In the north, there are fuel-based forest fires, which may be mitigated by careful forest management and controlled by confinement strategies. In the south, there are wind-blown vents, scrub and grasses where embers can be blown over great distances, so control is extremely challenging and mitigation requires suppressing ignitions. I wonder if you could comment on that. And then Scott Westerfield writes, I live in Southern California. We don't have the kind of forest density here, except in the mountains that you're describing. How does that translate to conditions down here?
Alrighty, I'll start with the first ones. There's those two models of fire spread and intensification definitely exist in California, but there are many more than that. They're sort of two extreme models. The chaparral grassland country is, as soon as it grows back, it's available to burn, and it burns like kerosene. And so it's a high fire danger environment, and we continue to build in it. That's going to be an expanding issue. In the north, where the forests are and a more Mediterranean climate exists, the scenarios that I talked about are more typical. In the oak woodlands used to be burned for millennia to keep the fuels way, way down. And so it's kind of in the middle. It's one of those situations where you could do grazing and burning and things like that to be able to significantly reduce fire behavior and emissions in those particular types. There's about 16 ecoregions in California, and they all have a somewhat unique fire regime. And so these are sort of end members and something in the middle.
And I imagine if you spread that across all of Western North America, there's even more. But just one sort of final question for you. Besides sort of more controlled burns and different approaches to forest management, do you see any other solutions? And talk to us a little bit about the experience with the Forest Service and the issues the Forest Service has had in managing forests in the West. I know that over time the percentage of the budget that the Forest Service has gone, predominantly nowadays to fighting fires and mitigating fires rather than many of the other things it used to do, and that's only increased over time. So where's the future hope here?
Again, a handful of questions there. Keep me honest so that I tag all of them, okay? I'll start with the last. 25 years ago, the Forest Service spent 17% of its gross budget on fire suppression and all the preparedness, asset development, that kind of thing. Today, it's more like 55 to 60% in a given budget year of the gross budget. And the subtractions have come from the proactive. So the fire suppression budget has increased, and the consequence has been loss of proactive work. The budgets have stayed level or increased overall, but essentially the increases to the fire suppression side and the preparedness side have come out of proactive work. So it's gone from 17% 25 years ago to 55 to 60% of the total budget is in suppression.
Okay. Any other things other than sort of prescribed burns, forest management that you would like to see so that we have a better future?
You bet. So what we're doing quite a bit of work in wilderness and backcountry and national parks with managed wildfires, where when we have moderate fire weather and the smaller fuels are available to burn, we can actually herd a fire around the landscape, get rid of the kindling so the bigger fuels can't ignite. That's one strategy, and it produces less severe wildfire and less emissions. Where the fuels have accumulated to such a degree that you can't look at fire-only solutions, then doing some of these thinning treatments followed by, and there's all sorts of levels of utilization in a bioeconomy, which are possible, you can also then reduce those emissions and the severity of the future fires. We have a project with BC right now with Werner Kurtz's lab to look at how we can store more forest in better configurations to do improved carbon accounting. And this ties very closely to this kind of question. Are there ways where you can actually create patterns where you can store more forest, but it's less vulnerable to fire? And we think we can.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. There's a lot of questions coming in for you. We'll try and tackle some of those at the end. But let me turn to Tess and ask her to take a sort of step back, give us a little bit of a global perspective, or at least a more national perspective about what we're seeing, what's going on, how these events that are increasing and are likely to get even worse are kind of in a feedback loop, positive and negative, with climate change. Tess?
Yeah, for sure. So I have a few visuals to talk about the climate change piece, and then maybe building on what Ricardo's saying about sort of the global piece, talk about how the smoke can impact us all, or not all of us, but at least those of us who don't live in the Western US as well. So first, I mean, what Dr. Hesberg is saying around climate change, increasing fires in the Western US and elsewhere is completely true. I think what's also interesting to think about is that smoke itself, as Ricardo was alluding to, can actually contribute to climate change in a few ways. And so I just wanted to give you a visual of sort of what I'm talking about. Here, the picture on the left is actually from a very recent fire in California, I think. And so it's showing sort of the three major components of smoke. And black carbon, as you can see here, is itself black, and basically it's absorbing incoming sunlight and leads to warming in the atmosphere. The other interesting part of black carbon, or BC, here I'm showing it on snow. And what's interesting here is that this also leads to warming because it's decreasing the Earth's reflectivity, or albedo, if you've heard that term. And many of you all, if you live in areas with snow, may have actually seen this on the side of the road. You can see that the snow covered in soot melts away quicker than sort of the pristine snow. So black carbon is interesting in that perspective. It's also the second leading warming agent after carbon dioxide, and fires emit roughly a third of the global total of that. So it's important to understand that. However, smoke gets a little more complicated because it also emits a lot of white carbon. So here it looks white, and that predominantly scatters incoming sunlight, which actually leads the atmosphere to cool. What's also interesting, though, is that some of this white carbon is brownish. As you can see here in this photo, it actually looks brown. And so it's also absorbing some of that incoming sunlight, a little bit less so than black carbon, but it's sort of this whole mixture of the different components of smoke that leads to sort of the total contribution to climate change from smoke. And so overall, scientists think that smoke has a warming effect, but the uncertainties on that are pretty large. So just briefly, if Ricardo's okay with it, I'm going to jump to sort of the air quality piece of smoke, and maybe tee it up for Dr. Henderson to talk about some of the health impacts as well. But so this is actually a figure from some recent work of mine that was published earlier this year. And what we're showing here is basically the 2012 annual average smoke surface concentrations across North America. So that's basically the smoke that humans would be interacting with. And so these four different plots are driven by the four most commonly used models of smoke, basically, smoke representation. And we put that into a chemical transport model to understand how that smoke maybe moves around North America. And the two sort of major takeaways from this is that depending on the model you use, you get really different smoke concentrations. And so all four of these are often used in air quality studies. And as you can see here, the distributions that humans would be interacting with are really different. The other important point here is that any of the yellows or reds that you're seeing here, so across a lot of the Western US and Western Canada, are actually above the World Health Organization's annual average limit for sort of healthy human exposure, which is pretty interesting because this is basically the annual average air quality in total that you would want folks to be exposed to. And what we're basically showing is that just the contribution from smoke, so not including power plants or cars or agriculture, is already above that limit in a lot of places in North America. And then just very briefly to sort of tie together how these fires in the Western North America might be impacting other places. I'm showing some satellite images. So the figure on the left is from 2004. It's a while ago, I'm sorry, but it does show what I'm talking about pretty well. Some of these fires, I think you can see my cursor, in Alaska and Canada were actually basically blocked by a dynamical system in North America, which shot the smoke down into Texas and actually led to exceedances of air quality standards there. And then also, as Ricardo was mentioning, so this is from this year actually, a lot of the fires, so those are the red dots here, sent smoke pretty much across North America and impacted where I was sitting in Boston, Massachusetts. So smoke both can intensify climate change and also leads to a lot of health impacts that I think Sarah will be talking to us about.
Yeah, that sets us up perfectly for Sarah. But one last question for you, Tess. Hearing Paul talk about, not only this year being, potentially normal, but it potentially getting worse over time if we don't address this problem. What are your thoughts in terms of, both how this affects climate change and how this is going to affect us all going forward?
Yeah, I guess I would add that it's a pretty complicated system. So humans can also decrease fires in some ways by breaking up the landscape. So it's a pretty complicated system to understand. The one sort of positive piece I was gonna try and leave you with from those satellite images is that our research enterprise has really improved a lot in the last couple decades. And so we both have a lot more observations globally. We also have a lot more expertise in terms of computational resources to model these fires and smoke and better instrumentation to better understand what we're seeing. So yes, we are definitely getting smokier, but yes, we also probably understand it a bit better.
And somebody on the chat asked, there's a striking red area over Idaho, Montana. Can you give an explanation?
It was a big fire year there in 2012, I think is the easy answer. The other piece of that is that these different fire inventories is what we call them. They sort of observe fires in different ways. And so the different satellite products that go into them see fires of different sizes differently, of different intensities differently. And so all of that can lead to different sort of spatial distributions as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Tess. Maybe we can turn to Dr. Henderson a bit. And, Tess has teed it up pretty well about the potential health impacts, not just right around where the fires are happening, but all across at least this continent and probably elsewhere. I know right now your mind is all on COVID since you are the equivalent of the CDC there in British Columbia, but you've done a lot of work on smoke and the impacts of smoke on human health. Can you tell us a little bit about, what should we be worried about? How should we try and mitigate those impacts and what can be done?
So we've had like 5 hours, right?
Just the TLDR version.
I'll do my best. Okay, so there's a couple of key things to start this discussion with. The first one is, what is wildfire smoke? You'll hear people talk about fine particulate matter or PM 2.5, and that's particles less than 2.5 microns in aerodynamic diameter. And if you look at this little cartoon in the bottom right-hand side, we're talking about the pink dots compared with the size of a human hair. What's important to understand is that this is just a proxy for what is an extremely complex mixture of different air pollutants, gases, and particles alike. And not only is that mixture complex, it's also highly dynamic. So once smoke is emitted into the atmosphere, it starts interacting with the atmosphere and changing, especially as it travels away from fires. So smoke is never the same thing twice. I always tell people you could grab a sample of smoke from a fire and 5 minutes later grab another sample, and you might get two very different profiles of chemically what that smoke is. So when we talk about smoke from landscape fires and we talk about PM 2.5, please keep in mind that that's not the only thing in there, and it's not the only thing that has health effects in there, but it is the thing that we measure a lot, and it is the thing that we know a lot about. Other potential pollutants of concern are volatile organic compounds, which can be very strong respiratory irritants, ozone as the smoke changes, and then depending on the composition of what's burning, all kinds of things might be in the particles themselves. The next thing I want to do is talk about what these particles actually are. So although this is a beautiful pink sphere here, when we look at it here, what's in that beautiful pink sphere is a bunch of soot balls, and they're very, very small, and then they agglomerate together over time to make these large particles. And this is important because there's a very high surface area to volume ratio for the particulate matter in smoke. So there's lots of surface area for once you breathe that smoke in to interact with the tissues in your body. Now, what happens when you inhale smoke? I think it makes a lot of sense to people that it would affect your lungs. It's going directly into your lungs, but it actually affects your entire body. That's because once it gets into your lungs, you have an immunological response to it, very similar to the response you might have to a virus or a bacterium. Your body says, foreign invader, and does all the things it does to attack a foreign invader, except that it can't neutralize the smoke the way it would be able to neutralize something biological. And that results in this spillover of inflammatory markers into the blood, and therefore affects every organ system in the body. We're also learning that some of these very small particles can actually cross into the blood themselves and therefore circulate through the entire body. So it's, even though it interacts mostly with your lungs directly, it has a whole body effect. Now, there's two aspects to that effect that we need to think of. First is the short term, and second is the long term. So when smoke is happening, people will have acute health effects because of that smoke. When the smoke goes away, those health effects will mostly dissipate. But what we know from the broader literature on air pollution is that your lifetime exposure to air pollution is the thing that is more strongly associated with your likelihood to develop chronic disease and your overall life expectancy. So we have to think not only about these extreme events when they occur, and trust me, smoke causes the most extreme episodes of air pollution that most people in North America are ever going to experience. We also have to think about how recurring exposure to those events is stacking up for kind of lifelong health effects and affecting chronic conditions, as well as these are very acute things that happens when smoke happens. So having said all of that, there are things that we know very well about smoke events when they occur. Anybody who has any pre-existing respiratory condition is going to be at higher risk. We know that smoke from landscape fires is more irritating and exacerbating for things like asthma and COPD than air pollution from other sources. We know that people are at higher risk of severe cardiovascular events. We know that people who have diabetes may have a harder time bringing their condition under control or maintaining their glucose levels because of that whole body inflammation can really mess with the whole endocrine system. So those are kind of the acute effects that we're well aware of. We are learning that if a population is exposed to an extreme wildfire season, their respiratory health may get knocked down and not return to baseline even long after that season is over. That's what they've been observing in Montana after the 2017 and 2018 fires there. So that's, we're developing more evidence around that. We are learning that women who are pregnant, again, they experience this inflammation, which may affect the growth of the fetus in utero, and that there's definitely a small drop in birth weight in infants who are exposed prenatally. There's probably more than that as well, but we need bigger data sets and better data to look at it more closely. That's currently happening in BC, Australia, and California. What we don't Oh, well, the one other thing that we've learned is that a population exposed to an extreme wildfire season seems to be primed for a more extreme flu season in the following flu season. So that kind of exposure in the summer has consequences a few months down the line when the flu season comes. That's probably true for COVID as well. And I think we're going to see that in the literature in the coming year. What we really don't know yet.
So you are seeing an interaction between this year's terrible fire season and COVID?
I'm not seeing it. It's not work that I've done. I know that other people are working on it, and I think we can confidently say that we will see those types of results coming. Finally, what we really don't know yet is if you live in a place that is routinely smoke exposed, how is your health different from exactly the same person who lives in a place that is not routinely smoke exposed over the course of a lifetime? We don't know that yet. I think a lot of people are looking to the necessary methods to understand that. It's not an easy thing to do, but I think we'll see that research coming over the next 5 years.
Okay, I'm not going to lie. Between you and Paul and Tess, you're starting to have a bit of a pessimistic view of the future of living in the Western United States. I mean, are you both saying that, you know, if you live anywhere where you're going to get these fires, you should probably move? Or are there other things that we should be thinking of? And we'll start with you, Dr. Henderson. Any thoughts on what we can do?
Oh, you know, I always have to walk this fine line between wanting people to be concerned about smoke and the fact that it affects their health and not wanting them to panic about it. For a very small number of people, smoke is a life-threatening exposure. For most people, it's not. You know, humans have lived in very air polluted places for long times. What we see in those populations is that their life expectancy is lower and they are more susceptible to chronic disease. And that's certainly not the ideal situation, but from a smoke perspective, I don't think Western North America is becoming uninhabitable. I do think we need to put a lot of thought into how we reduce people's exposures who continue to live here. And that's another multifaceted problem. But really, if we can reduce how much smoke people are exposed to, we can reduce both those acute and long-term health effects.
And I mean, are you talking about sort of staying inside, air filters, N95 masks? What are we thinking of here? And I noticed that, you know, at least this year we've seen a prevalence of different metrics for measuring air quality in any given place, both coming from the EPA as well as, at least here in the US, from the EPA, as well as from, you know, little sensors that people install in their homes, like Purple sensors and Purple network. I mean, how are you viewing this from a perspective? Like if we see that turn red, should we just stay inside, turn on air filters and wear N95 masks if we can? Or
I always tell people, listen to your body. Your body is trying to communicate with you. Some people are going to be very resilient to smoke. It's hardly going to bother them at all. I'm an absolute wuss. I'm a very healthy person, but as soon as it's smoky outside, I just want to die. So listen to your body. There's a lot of different technologies you can use. I really like to focus on the indoor environment. Very pathetically, most of us do spend the vast majority of our time inside, up to 95% in North America. And so if we can keep that indoor environment as clean as possible, we've gone 95% of the way to protecting people from these exposures. And that means indoor air cleaning in the short term. In the longer term, I think it means very careful revisitation of building codes in smoke-prone areas to ensure that when it gets smoky, we can keep that smoke outdoors as much as possible. And, you know, we've done the calculations in Canada, the average life expectancy of a building is about 70 years. So if we start making those changes, sooner or later, we're going to get to a place where our building stock is quite well protected from smoke.
Right. Thanks. Maybe Dr. Hesberg, before we turn to Zach to give us a little bit of maybe some rays of hope. Zach, prepare your little bag of hope, because we're going to need some. If talk to us a little bit about this question. You know, if you're young family in Western United States, should you move? Where should you move to? Or is this, you know, manageable? Don't go too crazy about how these changes are going to affect you in the long run.
Dr. Henderson created, I think, a really fair picture. On the management side, there are tremendous opportunities to buy down the severity of the wildfire and the smoke production across really large landscapes, one patch at a time. We treat those landscapes and we burn them under prescribed and wildfire scenarios. And what we find out is we can eliminate 60 to 90% of the emissions as a result of treatments. So the question is not, can we make it better? The question is, will we make it better?
And what's stopping us? Is it policy? Is it regulations? Is it information? What money? What's the hitch here?
Yes. All of those things. The land management, Forest Service is down 13,000 boots on the ground since the Reagan era. And that has to do with the diminishment of proactive funds available as a result of the fire service growing very significantly. So I think there are a variety of tools, and I like to describe this as a social problem with an ecological explanation. It's something that we need to make a decision about, but I think there's a fairly large toolkit, and there are significant opportunities to buy down the smoke and buy down the wildfire severity. I've been here 42 years and I'm going nowhere, because I believe that we can actually bust a move at a sufficient scale to be able to make a difference.
Right, and I think this sets us up nicely for the work that you're doing, Zach, because you know, Dr. Henderson has said, look, we need to do some of these management things on the ground, but there's a bit of a problem, and I'm going to paraphrase. And what I'm hearing is, you know, the Forest Service has been borrowing from the budget it has to prevent wildfires in order to pay for the budget it needs to manage existing wildfires. And lo and behold, you know, it gets worse the next year and the next year and the next year. So we're in a bit of a vicious cycle here, at least as regards Forest Service and their forest management budgets. I know we've been working on this solution that you're going to tell us about around how do you turn that around and how do you think about this differently? So tell us, what can Wall Street, what can finance do to help address this problem?
Yeah, absolutely. And Ricardo, you're right on. This is also a problem where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as the old saying goes. And I appreciate you acknowledging the Wall Street thing. I am a reformed Wall Street person, do come from a finance background. And I think what you've heard today from Dr. Hesberg and others is that this actually isn't a science problem. We know what needs to happen on the landscape. It's either a policy or a financial problem to make the resources available to do this work at a scale that's really commensurate with the threat of wildfire. And I think it's that question of scale, which has been one of the biggest challenges. When you ask Dr. Hesberg that question, he says, yes, yes, and yes. It has to do with the money, and it has to do with the policy. It also has to do with social license on the ground level. Are people okay with prescribed fire in their communities and around their second home in the Tahoe area, for instance, right? And you do get a lot of pushback in places like that. But taking a big step back, one of the things that I think we've realized at Blue Forest, and Ricardo before us and others before him, is that a healthy forest provides significant values in addition to reducing this risk of catastrophic wildfire. These forests, especially in California, 65% of our developed water supply comes from snowpack in the Sierra. That's at extremely high risk of wildfire. In a state like California, where we just came out of 5-6 years ago, the worst drought in 1,200 years, water is an incredibly important resource to be thinking about as we're thinking about managing forests. I'm not saying change how you manage the forest, but I am saying there's a lot of benefits in that forest that we're not acknowledging. And I think it goes back to being a classic public goods problem, right? You know, think about Ronald Coase on the economic side. These are all externalities that have not been internalized within the system. So how do we go about doing that? And I think, frankly, Ricardo and the team at Forest Trends and the ecosystem marketplace were some of the first pioneers of this work to say, we actually can acknowledge some of these benefits, and we can start to tie these benefits to certain stakeholders within that system and bring them into being part of the solution. So what we've done with our public-private partnership work here is to say, we understand that this work benefits the Forest Service, but it also benefits the state of California, benefits water utilities, electric utilities, flood control districts, private companies that bottle beer, water, soda, things like that. And now, as we're hearing more about the public health outcomes, the health and human services sector as well. And what we do at Blue Forest through the Forest Resilience Bond is allow all of those beneficiaries to quote unquote pay their fair share of these projects, bring folks together, because it costs 5 different stakeholders a whole lot less than it costs one stakeholder to do this work. And what's really been limiting that investment has been, we couldn't make the argument that it's a good investment from a utility, for example. But with the advances in science, we really can now. And just with this intro, before you get to your next question, Ricardo, I want people to think about it as, it's cool to have financial innovation. And we've built a product that looks and feels like infrastructure, project finance, because at the end of the day, this is natural infrastructure, right? But all of this financing hinges on the scientific innovation to be able to understand these benefits and value these benefits through the eyes of the stakeholders that are involved in these systems. So I guess I'll leave the intro there, Ricardo, but I think there's a lot more to touch on.
Yeah, no, definitely. So maybe what we can do is you can tell us a little bit about this, the Forest Resilience Bond, and how it works and how it's structured. And I guess I'll tee you up, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I see it is, what you have is, you're saying, look, we need to manage the forest. We need to do some of the things that Dr. Hesberger was telling us that need to happen. They cost money. The Forest Service budgets have been shrinking, have been getting more difficult to find to do that work. But that work actually has tremendous benefits, not just for people that might be impacted from the fires, but also for the water utilities, for, beer bottlers, a lot of people. So what you've done with the Forest Resilience Bond is saying, we're going to raise the money to do that work. And then we're going to find those beneficiaries and get them to contribute and pay into it. So then it's cheaper for the Forest Service, cheaper for the utility, cheaper for the beer bottler than if they tried to do it all by themselves. And we get the sort of outcomes that Dr. Hesberger was talking about. We manage the forest differently, and we, potentially mitigate the fires, right? You have a pilot of this product, this fire resilience bond, so a bond that can be sold to financial intermediaries. How's that going? What's been happening?
Yeah, thanks, Ricardo. And I want to say you've captured everything correctly there. And I'd say there's one more thing. It's not that any of these stakeholders are going to go solve the problem on their own, and it's cheaper for them to do it this way. If they don't come together like this, nobody has the resources to solve the problem on their own. So I want to reframe that a little bit, because the alternative for a utility is no action. And I think from everything you've heard on this webinar so far today, no action should not be a plausible next step for any of the stakeholders that are involved in forest health, given everything that we've learned. So about the project, I'm excited to share a little bit more. So this project launched in October of 2018. It's on the Tahoe National Forest, which is in California, and it's at the headwaters of the Yuba River on the Yuba River Ranger District for the Forest Service. And this was a project that covers about 15,000 acres. To give folks a sense of scale, the Tahoe National Forest itself is about 1 million, maybe 1.2 million acres. And this watershed that we're working on is about 300,000 acres. So this 15,000 acre project is pretty decent size for the Forest Service. But when you start to think about changing fire behavior within that watershed, you're not even close. This is really just the first step. So this financing closed, as I mentioned, end of October in 2018. And it was truly a public-private partnership in that we had funding that comes from the Forest Service, which is the federal agency in charge of national forest system lands. We had funding from the state of California. There's a $200+ million a year grant program that the state of California runs called the California Climate Investment Program that actually takes money from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, the carbon auction proceeds, and then invests that in forest health treatments. So that's how the state participates. There's other grant programs as well. And then what was really new about this was we brought in a utility that was a power producer. They are a water agency that sells onto irrigation districts, and they're a flood control district. And they were the stakeholder who has quite a bit to benefit from this project, but had not been putting any money into this before. And this was very new in California. We hadn't seen all the large damaging fires. We've seen some of them, but nothing like we've seen this year. But this is something that's actually really common in a state like Colorado, who went through tree mortality 10 years before California did, that had those large damaging fires. And now utilities there raising their hand saying, we'll help cover the NEPA costs, we'll help cover the project. That hadn't been done here.
Just for people who are not in the know.
The National Environmental Policy Act. So anytime the federal government is using money or taking action on federal land that's going to have an environmental impact, the government needs to analyze that and share that with the public. And the NEPA process is the collaborative public process through which the Forest Service gains authorization to take these actions on the landscape. And to give folks a sense, I do want to touch on one thing, Ricardo, of what happens in these projects. Dr. Hesburgh talked a lot about prescribed fire. Unfortunately, in much of California, our forests are way too dense to immediately put fire on the ground. So what often happens to do, you have to do both mechanical and hand thinning, going out there with machinery or an axe or a chainsaw, taking out some of those smaller trees, the ladder fuels that could cause a fire to, extend flame length and really start to climb up those trees. And then you can put fire on the ground. But also in these projects, we see things like meadow restoration, regeneration of native aspen groves that have been pushed out by conifer species, decommissioning of old logging roads. So when you look at one of these projects, you have to look at the sort of, how do we restore full ecological function to the system, not just reduce that risk of catastrophic wildfire, which again, is the main driver for doing these projects. But if you're there anyway, why not restore these meadows and help the hydrologic system from that perspective as well?
And I know that that you've also had participation from insurance providers and others, and then how are they playing a role, and what role are they playing?
It's a great question. So yeah, I talked about the acreage being protected, but I didn't talk about the size of the financing. So this was a small transaction, only $4 million, which again, sounds like a lot from a Forest Service perspective, but for folks like Ricardo in the investment world, that's a tiny, tiny financing. And it's something that doesn't quite meet the institutional nature that a lot of investors have. They want to be able to make bigger investments, and that's what we're taking some step toward.
Paradoxically, it's too small, right?
Interesting that, yeah. And when I say to the Forest Service, it would have been easier to raise $40 million than $4 million. They look at me like I have three heads. But if you say that to anybody in finance, they're like, why only 40? Why aren't you doing a $400 million raise, right? So it's all these sort of aspects from that perspective. But in doing that, in bringing those folks together, and as Ricardo mentioned, we have an insurance company that even after doing this investment, they did it purely because they want to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire. I said, you're field bending with your conservation finance investment. And the guy said, what's conservation finance? And then we had to go describe that, right? So it's really interesting to get people in there. And that is as much of a motivation for an insurance company as one of the impact investors that were a part of this transaction as well, right? One of them knew exactly what they're doing or why they're doing it. Other people have different reasons. There's no reason not to bring those folks together. And in doing so, we've really found there's a huge appetite in the insurance sector for this type of investment. And we've actually gone through the process of certifying our investment with the Department of Insurance in California so that any of the $4.5 trillion of insurance assets that are under management in California could actually invest in this solution. And you're going to need a lot of money. This is a multi-billion-dollar problem, as you heard from Dr. Hesburgh and others earlier in this talk.
So just to clarify a tiny bit, the way this has worked is essentially you said, okay, we need to do this thinning, we need to do this work on the ground. It costs a certain amount of money. What we'll do is we'll go to the insurance agent, we'll go to an agency, we'll go to impact investors, we'll raise the money, and then that gets paid back with a certain amount of interest for the insurer and the investor from this combination of the Forest Service, the water utility, other beneficiaries, right? That's sort of.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is a problem of immediacy. So, this was a project, this Yuba project that just covers 15,000 acres that the Forest Service expected to take 10 years to implement because they would have to do some sort of timber sale, wait for money to come in. Who knows if there was really any value in the timber because there's not much in many of these places. and they didn't have any money to do the project anyway, right? So this was a project where there was $4 million that the Forest Service needed. And even if they had the money and tried to chip away with annual appropriations each year, it would have taken them 10 years or more if they had finished. With the financing, this project could be done anywhere between 3 or 4 years, depending on what our burn windows are, and without significant additional investment from the Forest Service, which I think is critical because that funding is so limited. So again, problem of immediacy, the whole point of finance is to pull all those future cash flows, all those future commitments forward so that we can do the work now and really work to solve the problem.
Right. So it's kind of turning that vicious cycle that we were talking about into a bit of a virtuous cycle, in the sense that you're borrowing from future firefighting to pay for fire prevention today. So, and that's kind of the magic that I think finance brings and impact investment brings. So I know we've gone a little bit over time in terms of our portion of the conversation. I wanted to bring in folks that had questions online. Some of them have been posted, and some of them have been answered. But before I do that, are there any sort of questions from the panelists to each other, or any issues that the panelists want to bring up that haven't been brought up before we jump into the Q&A? Go ahead, Zach.
I just have one, and I don't know if this is for Dr. Henderson or for Tess, but you guys have been talking a lot about wildfire smoke. And one of the things that's been most problematic in a place like California, it's not just that the forests are burning, but it's the communities in and around those forests that are burning. So again, it's not just wood that's being burned up in smoke, but it's cars and septic systems and all these other things. I'd love for you to touch on that, because I remember living in Sacramento after I saw someone put a question in about the campfire in Paradise. I remember the air quality and all the people that came to Sacramento after that. But just wanted to touch on that impact, and like, is that 10 times worse? Is it just a little bit worse? How does that impact things, especially as we build closer and closer into these fire zones?
Maybe that's one for you, Dr. Henderson.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it, but then I'll probably hand it over to Tess as well, because it matters from both perspectives. Certainly, if we have anthropogenic material burning with our forests, that material is very dense. It creates a great deal of smoke. It has a very different toxicity profile from the forest fire smoke alone. How well that's understood and what role that plays in human health is still limited. Fortunately, in the grand scheme of fires, those fires, I know it feels like they happen a lot, and they do, but overall, that's not the type of smoke that tends to impact populations. There is some work going on related to the Fort Mac fires in Canada in 2016, where we'll hopefully learn a little bit more about that. And this is where I'll lead into Tess. In the smoke exposure modeling that we do for our work, we have a very difficult time modeling that smoke and trying to capture its air quality impacts in the models that we use to capture the impacts of smoke from other fires. It's a very, very different sort of beast, and Tess may know more from that perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I was basically going to say we don't really capture that sort of smoke, but there has been some work in our field looking at personal care products and how emissions from those sorts of things, so deodorant, shampoo, all of those things also contribute to air pollution. So that's a bit of a tangent, but to say that there is some new work trying to think about how sort of human created products, not necessarily when they're burned, but I could imagine that getting plugged into models soon are actually really large sources of air pollution as well.
I just don't want to also add a little bit to what Zach was saying about internalizing economic costs, because I think this is an incredibly important issue, not just in terms of fires and forest management, but also for many, many other environmental problems, whether it's climate change, water use, agriculture. I think part of the problem we have in our economic system is that it has been blind to many of the values that nature provides, and so blind to all of the different values that a forest gives or a stream gives, and also to the negative impacts health-wise of, you know, things like climate change or emissions or what have you, and finding ways to include those in the economic system, I think, is going to be extremely important. And what I like about, you know, the forest resilience bond is that it is, in a way, at least a tip of the hat to internalizing these economic systems. And it may not be all of the economic values that a forest provides, but at least some of them. And so I think we're going to need more of that and more value from that. So let's turn a little bit to the questions on the ground. I think there's a few for you, Zach. So maybe we can start there. Well, one quick one: can individual investors purchase forest resilient bonds the way they buy typical muni bonds? That one you can probably talk about relatively quickly, but there's also another one about to what extent can private landowners contribute to positive forest management? And this one we can bring in Dr. Hesberg, thinking particularly about large landowners like Weyerhaeuser and other big timber owners. And then there's one about insurance industry and what role the insurance industry plays. Maybe you can go deeper into that. So let's start with you, Zach, on anything you want to touch on any of those three.
Sure, I can be really quick on the institutional investor side. We can only work with institutional investors, not individuals, unfortunately, because this is a loan. A loan is not a security like a bond. It doesn't have a CUSIP. You can't find it on a Fidelity account. But what I would flag for folks there are groups that can take in retail investment. One of our investors was called Calvert Impact Capital. They are a leading fixed income impact investor. So you can put money with them. It's guaranteed in many ways, and then they'll invest in things that are highly impactful and pay something in the order of maybe 50 basis points or about 0.5% to their investors. So a lot of our work, Ricardo, is actually trying to reduce the risk in something like this so that all matches out. We don't have plans to take on individual investors at this point. That requires a little bit more on the back office side and the regulatory side than we're ready to take on at Blue Forest. But we will keep working with groups like Calvert and also donor advised funds, I think, are another big area where we'll see a lot of interest from investment and putting some of that capital to work as well.
But I think what's interesting about what you're doing is the potential for scale, because you're talking about 4 million for 15,000 acres, and this problem, as we've learned across the entire Western North America, is millions of acres. So potentially, hundreds of millions, if not billions or more dollars. So all of a sudden, pretty soon, a billion here, a billion there, you're talking real money. And potential for some of these big institutional investors. So maybe you can talk a little bit about, is this something that could also be done on private lands and the role private landowners can play?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And also one thing that needs to be acknowledged is the difference between those individual investors and the larger institutional investors. Ricardo's right, and he's actually underselling this problem. According to the Forest Service, there's a $100 billion backlog of this work, and we actually worked with them to see where can we get to accessible work and where are their downstream stakeholders and where is their sort of the highest fire risk. And at the very highest fire risk, there was an $8 billion opportunity. And if we include the medium high fire risk, that jumps up to about $44 billion in terms of could be operable, could get in there and could do some of that work. So this is a massive problem. That leads us to the type of investors that can make those larger investments. And those are largely pension funds. And it's a completely different investment than working with individuals. An individual wants a tax-exempt municipal bond. A pension plan, for a whole bunch of reasons, can't invest in anything that's tax-exempt because they themselves are tax-exempt and they don't need that. So while what we've started with is quite small, once you get to a larger scale, that's what you want to build the product for. So we want insurance companies and pension plans and groups like that. On the private land side, we actually had a grant for a couple of years from the Department of Agriculture to try to figure this out with a group called the American Forest Foundation that does a lot of outreach to individual landowners. And one of the biggest challenges in the West is that to go in and thin their land, it costs money. The value of the product that comes off the land doesn't cover it the same way it does in places like the Southeast, where it's longleaf and loblolly pine. And if you thin some of it out, you can make it into pellets and send it off to Europe. So that's been a big challenge. I think the way we'll incorporate private landowners, that there's a lot of benefits to that, which I'll get into in a second, is by working on a big chunk of Forest Service land or state land or BLM land, and then trying to touch the adjacent parcels that may be private land. And one thing that's happened, at least in the Western US, I don't know as much about Western Canada, is that as we built railroads, we sort of created this checkerboard of land ownership. That means if you create a solution that doesn't include private land, you're missing a large portion of the landscape, and you can't have a resilient watershed if you just treat national forest system lands and you leave the private lands alone from that perspective. So we need to bring that in. And to the benefit, you can generate voluntary carbon credits on private lands in a way that you can't do that on federal land. The biggest question in my mind, Ricardo, always comes back to scale. Can we get enough of these private landowners together, stepping forward in the same way on the same type of project on their landscape that's all in the same geography for it to make sense? And that aggregation piece is ultimately one of the biggest challenges when it comes to private landowners. So if you work with a land trust or an open space district or something like that, you've got a much better shot than needing to go quite literally door by door or road association by road association to touch these folks.
So I know Dr. Hesburgh has to leave us in about 15 minutes or a little bit less. So maybe we can take some of the questions that have been put there for you, Dr. Hesburgh. Yeah, I don't know if you've seen them or if you want to take them in a particular order, or would you like me to read out a few of them?
Why don't you pick the questions that are of most interest to you, Ricardo?
So one that's posted there says there's a global consensus to increase global forest cover to combat increases in CO2 emissions. How could this strategy impact the future forest fire trends, if at all?
It's a sexy idea to plant more trees and have that take care of the carbon equation. Unfortunately, as I think Dr. Henderson talked about from the smoke point of view, and as did Tess, in the wildfire vegetation climate arena, it's a lot more complicated than that. And a lot of our simulation experiments are suggesting that less may be more carbon storage, and it may produce less contagious conditions for forests and fires and wildfire spread over time. So that observation is lacking doing the detailed integrated work looking at interactions between carbon, wildfire, and the vagaries of climate over big space and time. And the early returns are suggesting that planting more trees over large areas in many ecoregions may actually make the problem worse.
Right. Yeah, and I think the key there is many ecoregions, because there's probably parts of the globe where at least a lot of the work there has been on preventing degradation or burning of existing forests in, say, the Amazon or places like that. And that's probably a very different scenario.
When you get to Amazonia, it's a completely different story. Growing that environment is incredibly important. And the geographic differences really matter, as they do in many parts of this discussion. So one size fits all strategies for investment and forest management and smoke accounting, they're not available as a broad blanket answer. They really matter. I wanted to tear to one of Zach's comments real quickly. The scaling issue is really important, just to sort of right size it. In the Western United States, we're treating about 1% of the acres per year. And our statistical evaluations are showing us that wildfires are not finding our treatments. So they're non-influential. In order to be able to create an influence, we have to be able to take wildfires out of the driver's seat. They're primarily managing the entire Western landscape right now, not intentional management. And to do that, something like scaling up to 4% of the area treated or 5% of the area treated in the early years is critical to change the contagion problem of very, very large landscapes. So essentially to rise up and overwhelm the wildfire situation, a large enough footprint has to be treated so that the primary driver is not previous acres burned by wildfires. Okay, and so scaling up quickly is a really important part of what Zach talked about. Going a little bit bigger is still going to contribute to wildfires are treating the landscape.
Right. There was another question of, controlled burns do make sense. However, given that the climate is changing and is hotter, drier, windier than when the indigenous prescribed burns occurred, what management control measures should be considered, understanding that controlling fire boundaries is more difficult now than in prior years?
it isn't necessarily more difficult now than in prior years. We have our fire seasons are longer, but when we actually do the detailed analysis of fire weather within years and across years, we're finding out we have many opportunities to do intentional burning treatments, for example, where the need is to simply do some prescribed burning to change the fuel ladder problem. I have to say, in the Western US on public lands, most of the acres cannot be just burned. They needed to be thinned and treated first in order to be able to get the expected fire behavior that you desire as a result. And in that particular situation, we have the opportunity to create substitution values as an alternative to those emissions. We can withdraw into a bioeconomy, not only commercial saw timber kinds of things, but also pellets and chunk wood that can be crushed, hauled out in a van, that sort of thing, that doesn't need to be burned. And so those kinds of methods are being explored, especially how can we grow intellectually and then in implementation a bioeconomy that uses more small material. So the mass timber question becomes really important to that, and which is basically using what used to be junk into making beams and structural members that we can put into 10 and 15 story buildings now. Mm-hmm. So there's tremendous opportunity to create those substitution values. Our project in BC is trying to do that. What scale does it take to withdraw smoke emissions and create substitution values in a bioeconomy that allows them to be able to buy down the carbon question? And the cousin of that is the smoke question, right?
So we have a question about instead of controlled burns, is lumber harvesting a viable option? They ask to reduce associated carbon emissions. Maybe very quickly, Dr. Hesburgh, and then Zach. I know you might have some thoughts on this as well.
Sometimes there's been heavy harvesting on Forest Service lands over the 20th centuries, but we still have commercial opportunities in some of those lands. In other places, simple investment in being able to treat the fuels is required to be able to put it on a better glide path. So it's case by case. You have to evaluate the geography and the landscape.
Zach, any thoughts here?
Yeah, and this is how it's always been done, paying for these projects with timber. And unfortunately, it creates the wrong incentives, especially from an ecological standpoint, right? The larger trees you can harvest, the more valuable those trees are. And so you're not going to allow that successional growth to come back into these forests the way that we'd really want to see it happen. So what often happens in these projects is there's upward diameter limits for what you can harvest. And the trees that you can harvest are so small, in effect, that they're not really all that valuable. At the end of the day, we still need people in the forest doing this work, and the timber and logging industry is really, really important. But at the same time, it's worth thinking about, hey, the water supply that we're making resilient in this project area is worth substantially more than the timber is ever going to be from that standpoint. So I think it's really important to consider that even in a state like California, where we have massive thinning needs, we import 80% of our timber from British Columbia, right? Because they haven't logged all their old growth the same way we do, and it's easier to get it and it's cheaper from that perspective. Doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And what the add-on effect from that, from a financial standpoint, is that a lot of our milling infrastructure is not right-sized to some of these smaller logs. And that's something we're starting to see in Oregon and Washington with groups like Vaughan Timbers and Vaughan Lumber, where they're actually looking at 14-inch diameter and below type material. As we get more business plans around that in oriented strand board and veneers and posts and poles and all those types of products, that's where this stuff can really start to take off. And to Dr. Hesburgh's point, we look at all this small diameter timber as a cost, and it often just gets burned in a pile. So it's one of my top priorities to figure out, how do we get that pile burning down to zero? We need controlled fire, broadcast burns, we need all that. We don't need to be doing pile burns though. That's a problem I think we can solve.
Sorry, Tess, one for you. Thanks, Tess. I noticed you used WHO guidelines for ambient concentrations of particulate matter. Have you found discrepancies in EPA versus WHO guidelines for air quality? And do you expect these guidelines to change with further research on human health effects, increasing wildfires in the future, et cetera? And maybe after you go, Dr. Henderson can comment if she has a comment on this.
Yeah, that sounds great. And thank you for the question. I actually I meant to mention this when I was talking about that slide. But yes, they are different actually. So the EPA has a standard of 12 micrograms per meter cubed. The WHO limit is 10, so that's for the annual average. But I think sort of maybe more interesting there is the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or the NAAQS, or the US of air pollution standards. And they get revised every 5 years. And so actually a lot of scientists at EPA we're just recommending that they do bring down the US standard to 8 or 9 micrograms per meter cubed. So scientists internal to EPA were saying that, and the Trump administration declined to bring down that standard. So my understanding is that the next administration doesn't have to wait 5 years for the next review cycle. They should be able to do something sooner. So we'll see. And yes, we've also seen with other pollutants that over time they have brought these standards down. It's not always sort of as quickly as maybe some health or atmospheric scientists might like, but we have seen those standards lower. I don't know if Dr. Henderson wants to add anything.
I just want to add that we can't consider those to be health-based standards. Health is one of the things that goes into how these numbers are decided, and there's no magical line at which the number is decided. It's a line in the sand and it can get moved around. From a human health perspective, as low as reasonably achievable is always the best. We call PM 2.5 a no threshold pollutant, meaning that we've never found a concentration at which it does not negatively affect human health. If we took all anthropogenic activity out of the world, the estimated annual average concentration for most people would be about 4 micrograms per meter cubed. So that's sort of as low as reasonably achievable might ever achieve. But, you know, lower is better. And just always remember that number doesn't solely exist to protect health. It exists partially to protect health. It exists partially to be feasible under the current economic and industrial conditions, I guess. And there's a lot of things that go into it. So, you know, the World Health Organization number is quite conservative in some ways, not for North America, but for many parts of the world, that isn't actually achievable, and it won't be achievable for a long time.
I think there are a lot of questions around the issue of should people move out of the West. Maybe we didn't leave them with enough hope on that. If anybody wants to take these, there is a question around the Forest Service and participation with Indigenous communities. Has there been talk of partnership is basically sort of the nub of the question. Have you seen anything like that, Dr. Hesberg?
Absolutely. It's a time of great interest, and thanks for the question, whomever asked it. We have projects throughout Western North America working with Canadian First Nations and then Western Indigenous tribes in the Western US. And the knowledge, the traditional knowledge of cultural burning and stewardship practices is immense. I like to describe it in some of my talks that they've forgotten more than we know right now, because the detailed use of fire for hundreds of different uses is incredibly compelling, and it's leaving the building right now. And so these projects are trying to basically yoke Western and Indigenous knowledge to find out whether or not we can do practices on the landscape that are more clever, and they produce an improved set of values over some of the traditional methods from the 20th century. And I have high hopes for it, frankly. There's a lot of good work going on. I think, Zach, you interacted with some of that work down in your neck of the woods as well, did you not?
Absolutely. There's everything, I would say, from Indigenous or tribal consultation on these projects that the Forest Service engages with, to actually finding ways to get tribally descended folks or members on the ground, actually putting fire on the ground and doing some of this work. So it's everything from being a part of that planning process to actually implementing these projects. And there's lots of opportunity across the board there. And frankly, these are the kind of rural jobs that are often needed in these places, regardless of race or where you come from. Many of these places had tremendously high unemployment prior to COVID, and that's something that's only gotten worse. And I think that's what we need to talk about too a little bit, is the work that's involved in this, whether you're a chainsaw operator or you're doing vocation, you have to get vocational training to operate heavy equipment, or you're becoming a burn boss, which you might need years of training to get your red card. And that's still one of the coolest titles I think I've ever heard for a job. But it gives you that wide variety of skill so that there really is a job for anybody in the woods, especially if we want to scale this stuff up, because we're already at system capacity with contractors and folks who can do this work. So we got to look at, where do we need more infrastructure? Where do we need more human resource capacity? And how can we bring in some more of the intelligence that that Dr. Hesberg's talking about? They've forgotten more than we ever know. I love that aspect of this. So much more experience.
And that points to an interesting angle in terms of like employment in an era where there's so much unemployment. Can we create jobs doing some of this work, which I think is politically important as well as just socially important.
And Ricardo, I'll tell you, a perfect example of that is this summer, the crew at the National Forest Foundation that managed this project, they worked all summer, despite COVID and despite the worst fire season I've ever seen in California. I don't know how many years we have to go back to find one worse. But to think, while all these terrible things are happening, this work can actually continue. There's not too many other professions you can say that of, right? And I think that's an important thing to call out.
Yeah. One for either you, Tess, or Dr. Hesberg. I was taught that black smoke was due to burning cars and houses, and white smoke was due to burning timber and natural forest materials. Is that not true?
Sure. I answered a similar question typing it out, but so at least in our work, the flaming fires, sort of hotter, generally lead to more black carbon. They also lead to the more absorbing brown carbon. And then also the underlying fuel type will depend on that. So I'm not an expert on burning cars and houses and such, but my sort of educated guess is that the underlying sort of combustion processes would carry over. So you probably need hotter fires to be burning cars and that sort of thing, which would be black smoke. I don't know if Dr. Hesberg wants to jump in.
That's great. One quick addition is that an awful lot of the smoke we're trying to avoid comes out of fires that consume deep duff and litter layers. That's where you can still see needles and bark shed, and you can no longer see the parent material in the duff layer, and then smoldering on big logs. And that's where the real savings is in doing the work. You can have tonnages of large logs on the forest floor, but if you rob them of their kindling with these lighter burns, they don't ignite, and you can subtract that smoldering combustion. And that really changes the content of the smoke and its damage. And so in many ways, being able to do these lighter burns to get the 1/4 inch, 1 inch, 3 inch material off the forest floor is a really savvy move. You don't have to burn up the big logs, which is the tonnage.
I just want to add a little bit of a health piece to this. So it's really about the completeness of the combustion. And certainly when we're talking about black versus brown versus white, we're talking about how completely the material has combusted, and that does kind of change the toxicological profile of smoke quite a bit. So it's just another piece of the puzzle.
So we've come to the sort of 90-minute mark. I know at least Dr. Hesberg has to leave us. I'd ask the other panelists if you're willing to keep going. If not, we will end it here. Zach, are you okay for a few more minutes?
I got 15, Ricardo, so yeah, I can say.
Tess?
Yeah, that's fine.
Dr. Henderson?
Yeah, I can give a couple more minutes if there's more burning questions.
Let's go a couple more minutes. We have a bunch more questions. Some have come in even as we've said these things. So let's start with one that says, here in Santa Cruz, California, our city council decided in the 1990s that they were, quote, philosophically opposed to logging on city watershed lands. The $250,000 a year they used to bring in from selling redwoods used to go to forest management. 25 years later, their forests are choked with fuel that is reducing much of their water supply via evapotranspiration. In addition, this summer's fires saw lots of the San Lorenzo Valley watershed reduced to a toxic wasteland. How do we overcome the, quote, nature myth, so that people once again recognize that allowing land to go fallow reduces rather than improves its value, especially in the current era of invasive plants.
Man, that's a good one. And I would say at least you have some valuable species there that could be harvested. We unfortunately don't have beautiful coastal redwoods up in the part of the Sierra that we're working in. It's a really interesting question. I think it kind of harkens back to the history of the timber wars, right? I mean, if you think back, late 80s, early 90s were sort of the beginning there. And what really came out of there were governance structures at a local level that could help build support to do this type of work on the ground. And these are called forest collaboratives. We work amongst a number of forest collaboratives all across the Western, just US, not up in Canada yet, but those are local units, often not even a legal entity, that are comprised by the stakeholders in that area that work together to say, here's what we're comfortable with on our landscape, and here's what we think makes sense, taking into account all the different trade-offs that you have to think about when you're planning a conservation project. So maybe that's a great example of something that is maybe not better left to the politicians, but actually better left to the local stakeholders, and you could see that coming with a better outcome. I do want to say also that the landscape in terms of how people look at this work has changed dramatically from the early 90s. This was called logging for water and all sorts of bad things back in the day. I think people do understand your point on ET, and the question is exactly right, that in addition to being really unsafe to have these forests like that, they are utilizing more water resources, which either means less available for human consumption downstream, or more trees that are stressed and not getting the water they need, which makes them more susceptible to bark beetle or other things like that. So yeah, I would love to see it. History gives us a lot of context as to why people may have said those things when they did too. And it's good to see that that's changing now.
Yeah, I would add that I do think, we need a much more nuanced view in terms of how we see natural systems and our role within natural systems, and what we can and should not do, and should do. And I think that's in part mediated also by, increases in population, spreading out of population, the more changing of the sort of nature, people boundaries over time, as well as us becoming considerably more urban as a species, and most people coming from cities or living in cities with less understanding of some of these natural processes, or living with some of these natural processes in a different way. But I think we're going to have to come to a big, kind of, I hate to use the term "come to Jesus" moment, but something like that in terms of how we interface with natural systems, because I think it's not just at that level of a nature myth and the psychology of what is natural or not natural. As Dr. Hesberg was showing us, a little less than 100 years, what was considered natural was very different than what we're seeing now, and what we think of as natural systems may not have been there at that time. But also at the systemic level and the way our institutions interact with natural systems. I think we built our economic system at a time when what was scarce was capital and labor. And so that's what we valued. Natural resources were not the thing that were valued. They were the thing to be dealt with. They were the swamps to be drained. They were the fish to be caught. They were the forest to be caught. And, God, on the banks of Maine, people were pulling up cod by the bucketful, and we're thinking to themselves, there's no way we're going to impact this. Or bison in the Western United States. And here we are where, both those have been on and off the endangered species list for some time now. So what's scarce now, I think, is some of these ecosystem services, some of the values that nature provides in terms of clean air, clean water, all of these other things. And I think until we build that into our economic system, we're really not going to be able to deal with these questions fundamentally. And it's kind of like, the operating system of our economy is based on something, from way back. So it's not like running Windows 95 in a world of Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, and having that blue screen of death come up, and people on this call may not even know what the blue screen of death was in computers. So, I'm dating myself, but never mind. And on our economic system, we're operating on an operating system that it was like 1795. So unless that changes, I think we're going to have more and more of these problems and more of this clash with natural systems. All right, so off my soapbox. Should insurance companies start restricting the availability of insurance for those who would rebuild in fire-prone areas, a la what happens in flood-prone areas? Anybody?
This is the sticky political question for a whole bunch of reasons. I want to outline the importance of insurance before trying to give you an answer to this question, especially for folks that aren't aware of all the implications. In many of these rural communities, the vast majority of the tax base is property tax. And when you're in an area where you can't get insurance, and it's not that the insurance companies should drop these people, these insurance companies are dropping these people. And there's something called the FAIR plan in California, which is sort of the government backstop plan, like FEMA flood insurance plan, same idea, it's quite expensive. And the big challenge is if you can't insure these homes, nobody can sell their home, right? Because you can't get a mortgage without this insurance. So then you can't sell the home, so the home value goes down, and then you have less property tax dollars going in. So the counties themselves don't have the resources to actually solve some of these problems. So from an actuarial standpoint, should insurance companies drop people? Yeah, they shouldn't be insuring these risks. The fires in 2017 knocked out all of the past profit for the last 20 years of the P&C insurance sector in California. 2018 was much worse than 2017. And 2020 was a lot worse than either one of those. So when you start to look, that's 20 years of profits in one year, and then a worse year, and then a worse year. So obviously they're going to stop doing this. Doesn't mean people don't need insurance in some of these areas. So is insurance a right? That's a political question that folks can answer. I won't delve into.
Yeah, I think we've seen them dropping people, so I think it's happening. I don't think it's necessarily going to help, because I think, you know, population dynamics are what they are, and they actually, as a result of COVID, we've seen a shift to more people moving out of places like San Francisco to, you know, places like Montana or rural California. So you know, tough one. There was another one that I'll throw it out to whoever wants to answer it. It says, I was from the wider Paradise, California area that was leveled by the Camp Fire in 2018 during my senior year at Brown. There wasn't a day that went by this past summer where I wasn't worried about another Paradise-like devastation occurring near my family's current home near Redding, California. Is there hope for the future? What can communities do to better protect themselves? Or is it time to consider moving out of more rural Northern California areas?
So it's too bad Paul's dropped off the conversation, because he's probably the one who could best answer this question. But in my conversation with forest ecologists, you know, the creme de la creme of community protection is basically to have a golf course around your community of, you know, very low vegetation, a few trees here and there, more similar to those, you know, pictures that Paul was showing at the beginning of his talk, because that's what's going to protect against big fire moving into those communities. And it has to be kind of a 1 to 2 kilometer buffer. And I do believe that I read that that is how they are planning to rebuild Paradise as they work on it, and to keep that really cleanly maintained buffer between the wildland and the urban interface.
Yeah,
Ricardo,
I guess you'd have to worry about pesticide use on those golf course and herbicide use. So, you know, there are other health benefits.
You know, the best practice is to have the goats ranging there and that sort of thing. So
maybe, yeah, maybe we can find alternative uses for those lands, maybe range lands of some sort, which kind of was probably what was happening in those photos that Paul was showing in the 1930s. So, you know, grazing of some sort. Did you want to say something, Zach?
Just quickly, I hear a hint, and maybe I'm just sensitive to this because I'm actually married to a clinical psychologist, but I think there's something else in that question, and that's the mental health of people in these areas and wondering, can I go outside with my kids? Am I going to be safe? And I'm talking about this from a Sacramento perspective, which is about an hour and a half from Paradise, where it impacts us so that we can't leave our homes. That's not nearly the same kind of impacts that's happening to people on the ground. And even that has a mental health impact on us. So I would encourage people not just to think of human health as or respiratory health, which we've talked a lot about today, but also the mental health that comes along with some of these events, and PTSD and how our body reacts to trauma in some ways.
A question of, if the fires are caused by the government not providing enough funds for management of the forests, are they liable for any damages, homes, business, health? I think, liable is probably the wrong word, because all of the, the money they're not putting in is being allocated by Congress and by our representatives. So, are they liable for not putting that in? Probably not. I think what we need to do is it's much more of this grassroots type of thing. It's not about suing the government. It's about changing the government to one that sees this type of management as more effective and better in the long term, and looks after our interests in the long term. And what does that look like? How do we get there? I think that's the kind of questions that I think we need to be asking. And also, what does the community look like? What does resilience in a community out west really look like? And how do we maximize for health and other benefits as going forward? So I'd say less about the liabilities. There's a few more questions, but I'm cognizant of the time, and I know everybody's probably going to have to run. So I'll just thank our panelists. It's been tremendous. I think, I've learned a ton about some of these issues, ranging from forest management to health to financial approaches to doing that. So I really, really want to thank you for that. And I want to thank Brown and the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society for helping host this, and for encouraging this kind of conversation about what is the interface between environmental issues, environmental problems, and social, economic, and other issues, because I think that's really where the rubber hits the road. I think in most of the environmental problems we see, it's less about, the biology of the problem or the biological answers, or even the physical questions, although those are extremely important. It is about how we get those things done from a social perspective, and that interface between science, environment, and society, I think, is one that I think we're going to need to rebuild and make stronger going forward. So thank you so much for everyone that participated. And thank you, all of you, for joining us on this.